Look closely at this photograph. A man crouches on the ground, his body chained, his head locked inside a massive wooden frame. The heavy collar, known as a cangue, surrounds his neck like a suffocating cage. On its surface, written notices proclaim his crime for all to see. This was not simply a punishment. It was a spectacle. In late Qing dynasty China, the cangue was one of the most feared tools of justice. It was heavy, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. The central hole allowed the prisoner's head to fit through, but only barely, just enough to breathe, to swallow, maybe to drink water. Escape was impossible, comfort non-existent. Every movement was pain, but the true cruelty of the cangue was not its weight. It was its purpose. It turned punishment into theater. The prisoner became an exhibit, displayed before neighbors, strangers, even children, as a living warning of what happened to those who broke the law. Imagine the scene: a marketplace buzzing with life, merchants shouting prices, families bargaining, and at the center, a man in the cangue, kneeling under the sun, his crime written across his chest. People stop and stare. Some jeer, others whisper. Children point with curiosity, then turn away. His suffering becomes their lesson. His shame becomes their entertainment. This was justice in the form of humiliation. The Chinese legal system of the time did not rely solely on prisons or executions. It believed in the power of shame. To strip a man of dignity, to make him a living symbol of failure, was seen as more effective than any whip. The cangue came in different sizes and weights. Some were light enough to be endured for days. Others were so massive they crushed the shoulders, leaving bruises, bleeding sores, even broken bones. The length of confinement varied with the crime. Petty theft might mean a few days. More serious offenses could mean weeks or even months. For some, the punishment ended not in release, but in death from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. And always, the punishment was public. That was the point. A man locked in a cell was hidden from view. A man in a cangue was a warning to everyone who saw him. His humiliation became a performance of authority. The state used his body to broadcast its power. The photograph freezes this moment forever. The man's eyes look sideways, filled with exhaustion, perhaps anger, perhaps despair. His hands press into the dirt, struggling to hold up the weight on his neck. The cangue towers around his head, making him appear smaller, weaker, less than human. And that, too, was its purpose: to transform a person into an object, a cautionary tale nailed in wood. Punishments like this were not unique to China. Across history, societies have used humiliation as a tool of control. In medieval Europe, criminals were locked in stocks or pillories, forced to endure the insults of passers-by. In colonial America, public whippings and branding were common. But the cangue was uniquely Chinese in its scale, its ritual, and its symbolism. It combined physical suffering with cultural notions of honor and shame. To wear the cangue was to lose not only comfort, but face. And in a society where family reputation was everything, the disgrace spread far beyond the prisoner. His relatives carried the shame. His children bore the whispers. The cangue punished not just the man, but his entire household. This photograph, stark and unflinching, is a doorway into that world. A world where justice was not hidden in courtrooms, but paraded in the streets. A world where the weight of wood was matched only by the weight of humiliation. This is where our journey begins, with a collar of wood, a man on his knees, and a society that believed the greatest punishment was not pain, but shame. The cangue did not appear suddenly in Qing dynasty China. Its roots stretched deep into centuries of law, philosophy, and culture. To understand why a society would create such a device, we must look at the foundation of Chinese justice itself. In ancient China, two schools of thought dominated the conversation about order and discipline: legalism and Confucianism. Both shaped how punishments were imagined, but in very different ways. Legalists believed that human nature was fundamentally selfish, chaotic, and prone to crime. To control society, rulers needed strict laws and harsh punishments. Mercy, they argued, only encouraged rebellion. Order came not from kindness, but from fear. Within this framework, public humiliation was a powerful tool. If one man's disgrace could prevent 10 others from breaking the law, then the punishment had served its purpose. Confucianism, on the other hand, emphasized morality, harmony, and family honor. It taught that shame was one of the strongest forces shaping behavior. To lose face, to bring dishonor upon oneself and one's family, was worse than physical pain. For Confucians, the threat of shame was a way to guide people back to virtue. The Cangue was born at the crossroads of these two philosophies. It combined the legalist emphasis on fear with the Confucian emphasis on shame. It hurt the body, but more importantly, it destroyed dignity. It turned a private crime into a public disgrace. The earliest versions of the Cangue appeared during the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century, though similar practices existed earlier. By the Qing Dynasty, it had become a standardized punishment. Imperial law codes detailed exactly how it should be used, the size of the wooden frame, the length of confinement, and the crimes that merited it. Small offenses such as gambling, theft, or minor fraud might result in a lighter Cangue, worn for a few days. More serious crimes, like desertion or corruption, could bring heavier versions, worn for weeks or months. Some Cangues weighed more than 40 kilograms, pressing on the shoulders until they bled. The heaviest became a slow execution, killing through exhaustion and starvation. But what mattered most was not the wood, it was the eyes of the crowd. Punishment in China was never only about the individual. It was about teaching society a lesson. A man locked in a Cangue on a busy street became a warning visible to hundreds. His disgrace rippled outward, shaping how others thought, spoke, and acted. This is why the Cangue was not hidden in prisons but placed in markets, near temples, outside government offices, anywhere people gathered. The location turned the punishment into a stage. The criminal became an actor, unwilling and broken, while society became the audience. The role of written placards added to the humiliation. The boards often carried inscriptions describing the crime, the name of the offender, and sometimes insults labeling him as a cheat, a thief, or a liar. This was a form of branding, but instead of a mark on the skin, it was a declaration nailed above the head for everyone to read. And because Confucian values placed so much importance on family honor, the shame extended beyond the prisoner. His relatives suffered by association. Neighbors whispered. Employers avoided them. Marriages became harder to arrange. The Cangue punished not only the guilty, but everyone connected to him. What makes the Cangue particularly striking is that it was not designed to draw blood. It did not cut like a whip, or pierce like an arrow, or burn like fire. Its cruelty lay in its restraint. By keeping the victim alive and visible, it maximized humiliation. It was pain without mercy, shame without end. This philosophy, that shame could discipline society, explains why the Cangue endured for centuries. It was not just wood and iron. It was an idea that dignity could be destroyed more effectively than flesh. An idea that humiliation was as sharp a weapon as any sword. And for countless men and women across China, that idea became a reality too heavy to bear. Punishment in 19th century China was not something hidden behind prison walls. It was staged, performed, and displayed like a grim theater. And at the center of this theater stood the Cangue. The philosophy behind it was simple. Fear works best when it is shared. To punish one man in private was to correct only one life. But to punish him in public, in the marketplace, in front of neighbors and strangers, was to turn his suffering into a lesson for everyone. The placement of the Cangue was deliberate. Officials ordered prisoners to be displayed where people gathered, outside temples, at crossroads, beside busy markets. A man in a Cangue was as visible as a banner. He could not be ignored. His humiliation became unavoidable, an unwelcome but unforgettable part of daily life. Crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear, others simply for entertainment. Mothers pulled their children closer, pointing at the man and whispering warnings, "Do not end up like him." Merchants paused their bargaining to stare. Strangers read aloud the inscriptions posted on the wooden frame, announcing the prisoner's crime for all to hear. The event became a ritual. The prisoner's body was the stage, his shame the performance, and society the audience. In this theater, everyone had a role. Officials acted as directors, ensuring the punishment was seen. Onlookers became participants, reinforcing the message with their stares, their whispers, sometimes their laughter. And the prisoner, unwilling and broken, became the actor who carried the weight of the drama. The power of this theater was psychological. Seeing a thief whipped might inspire sympathy, but seeing him confined to a Cangue, his crime written above his head, his dignity stripped away, turned him into a warning. The punishment was not about blood, but about reputation. It showed that no one, no matter how clever or strong, could escape the judgment of society. For the prisoner, the humiliation was crushing. He could not hide his face. He could not escape the eyes. Even the simple act of trying to drink water or eat food became part of the spectacle. People watched as he struggled to bring food to his mouth, his arms restricted by the heavy frame. Every clumsy movement added to the mockery. Theatricality extended beyond the Cangue itself. Officials sometimes paraded prisoners through the streets, forcing them to march under the weight of the wooden collar while crowds jeered. Others were tied in rows, displayed like exhibits for the passing public. The act of humiliation was never silent. It was noisy, crowded, filled with voices reinforcing the message. And that message was clear. Crime did not only bring punishment. It brought disgrace. To break the law was to lose not only freedom, but face. The shame was the real sentence. The theater of justice also strengthened authority. By staging punishments so publicly, rulers demonstrated their control. The Cangue was not only about the prisoner, it was about the state itself. It showed that the government's reach extended into the most personal realm of all, a man's honor. Travelers from the West who visited China in the 19th century were struck by the spectacle. They wrote in their diaries about seeing prisoners locked in massive wooden collars, surrounded by crowds. Some compared it to medieval European punishments like the stocks or pillory. Others saw it as uniquely Chinese, a reflection of a culture where shame was sharper than the lash. To modernize, these scenes may seem cruel, but to those who lived in Qing China, they were ordinary, even expected. The Cangue was not hidden or rare. It was part of the rhythm of justice, a familiar reminder that the law ruled not just the body, but the spirit. This was the theater of punishment, a drama staged not for the guilty, but for the living, a performance designed to terrify, to instruct, and to ensure that the next man thought twice before breaking the law. The Cangue was one instrument in a vast system of punishment. To understand its place in Chinese law, we must see it not as an isolated cruelty, but as part of a hierarchy, a ladder of pain and humiliation carefully designed to match crime with suffering. At the lowest rung were fines and warnings. Minor offenses might result in payments to the authorities, a confiscation of goods, or a public reprimand. These punishments hurt the wallet more than the body, but they still carried shame. In a society where reputation was everything, even a recorded warning was a stain. Next came corporal punishments, the most common being the bamboo cane. The infamous bamboo rod was thin, flexible, and devastating. A single strike could slice the skin. A series of strokes left welts, bruises, and sometimes permanent damage. Officials wielded the bamboo with calculated precision, light for petty crimes, brutal for repeat offenders. The lash was a language the body could not forget. The Cangue stood above the cane, reserved for crimes too serious for a beating but not grave enough for execution. It was a middle ground, harsher than physical blows because of its duration and humiliation, but short of death. The Cangue punished not only with pain but with spectacle, stretching suffering over days or weeks, turning one mistake into an ongoing display of disgrace. Above the Cangue were the labor punishments, exile and forced work. Criminals could be sent to remote provinces, condemned to dig ditches, build walls, or toil in mines under brutal conditions. Distance and hardship tore them from their families, ensuring they vanished from their old lives. For many, exile was a slow death, as dangerous as any blade. And then came the punishments that ended life. Execution in Qing China took several forms. The most merciful was beheading, swift and final. More severe was strangulation, carried out in public as a warning. The most dreaded of all was the infamous lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts, reserved for treason or heinous crimes. Though rare, it loomed large in the imagination, a symbol of ultimate state power over the body. Placed within this spectrum, the Cangue becomes clearer. It was not simply cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a tool carefully positioned between pain and death. Its role was to prolong suffering without ending it, to mark the body with humiliation rather than blood. Where the lash ended in minutes and the sword ended in seconds, the Cangue stretched punishment across time. What makes this hierarchy striking is its logic. Chinese law codes did not treat punishment as random vengeance. They were detailed, codified, and precise. Each crime had its matching sentence, calibrated to reinforce both authority and morality. A thief might endure the Cangue to show that dishonesty carried shame. A deserter might face exile to show that betrayal carried separation. A traitor might face death to show that disloyalty carried finality. Western observers often recoiled at these punishments, calling them barbaric. But within China, they were seen as necessary to preserve order in a vast empire where millions of people lived under the emperor's rule. The punishments were not simply about the criminal. They were about maintaining harmony across society. And always, the element of shame was central. Whether it was the sting of the cane, the chains of exile, or the spectacle of the Cangue, punishment was designed to leave scars not just on the body but on the soul. A scar reminded the individual. A public display reminded everyone else. The Cangue thus symbolized the balance of Qing justice. It was heavy, humiliating, and enduring, but it stopped short of death. It left the condemned alive, but broken, a warning etched in wood and memory. This ladder of suffering reminds us that punishment was not merely about retribution. It was a system, carefully staged, designed to maintain order through fear, shame, and the slow weight of pain. To understand the true cruelty of the Cangue, one must step inside it, not as a historian, not as an onlooker, but as the prisoner himself. The collar was massive, often stretching wider than the prisoner's shoulders, made of thick, rough wood. Once locked in place, it became a cage for the head and neck. The hole was cut just wide enough to keep the skull from slipping out, but tight enough to make every movement a struggle. Breathing was possible, eating was possible, but comfort was impossible. The first sensation was weight. Some Cangues weighed 20 or 30 kilograms, pressing down on the collarbones and shoulders until they ached. After hours, muscles trembled. After days, the wood dug into the flesh, leaving open sores that oozed blood. The prisoner could not lie down fully, could not rest his head. Sleep became shallow, broken, haunted by pain. Then came the hunger. Though prisoners were sometimes allowed food, eating was a humiliating ordeal. With the Cangue fixed around the neck, lifting food to the mouth required awkward angles. Rice spilled, broth dripped, and each attempt drew laughter from the crowd. Drinking was worse. Water had to be poured carefully, like feeding an animal. Many chose thirst over the humiliation of being watched while they fumbled to swallow. The sun added another layer of torment. Exposed in open markets or courtyards, prisoners endured heat that turned the wood into a furnace. In winter, frost gathered on the frame, chilling the body until numbness set in. Rain soaked the Cangue, making it heavier, trapping cold against the skin. The prisoner was at the mercy of the elements, day and night. But perhaps the deepest wound came not from wood, weight, or weather. It came from eyes. The endless eyes of strangers. Every passerby became a witness. Some looked with pity, others with disgust, others with curiosity. Children pointed, merchants muttered, officials looked on with indifference. To be inside the Cangue was to be trapped not only by wood but by judgment. The humiliation was relentless. Signs nailed to the Cangue announced the prisoner's crime in bold characters. Thief, cheat, liar. Each word was a sentence of its own, branding the prisoner more deeply than any iron. The labels turned the condemned into walking warnings, stripped of identity and reduced to a single act of shame. Psychologically, the weight was unbearable. Many prisoners described feelings of despair, of losing themselves under the constant gaze of others. Shame sank deeper than hunger. It was not only the body that was trapped. It was the soul. Some endured for days, others for weeks. A few survived months, though their bodies wasted away under the strain. Death was not the intent of the punishment, but it was not uncommon. Starvation, infection, exhaustion, all could end a sentence early. And even when prisoners lived, they often carried scars for life. Shoulders hunched, necks stiff, spirits broken. Yet survival required resilience. Some found ways to endure by turning inward, shutting out the noise of the crowd. Others leaned on family members who brought food and whispered encouragement. A lucky few found compassion in strangers who offered water or shade. But for most, the experience was one of total isolation, even in the middle of a busy street. This was the essence of the Cangue, to make punishment visible, unending, and unforgettable. A whip cut for a moment. A prison cell hid the condemned, but the Cangue kept its victim on display, turning every minute into another blow of shame. To live inside the Cangue was to carry a burden heavier than wood. It was to become a symbol of disgrace, a living reminder that in Qing Dynasty China, the loss of dignity was often a harsher punishment than the loss of life. To fully grasp why the Cangue was so devastating, one must understand the cultural weight of shame in Chinese society. For centuries, honor was not just a personal virtue. It was the foundation of family, reputation, and survival itself. Confucian philosophy placed immense value on face, the respect, dignity, and social standing a person carried within the community. To lose face was to lose trust, credibility, and honor not only for oneself, but for one's entire family line. In this cultural framework, humiliation was worse than pain. Pain ended, disgrace lingered. The Cangue exploited this belief to its fullest. By forcing criminals into the open, stripped of dignity, it transformed private shame into public humiliation. Every glance from a stranger was another blow. Every whispered insult was another lash. A man locked in would carry not only his own disgrace, but the disgrace of his ancestors and descendants. In a Confucian world, family reputation was collective currency. A son's honor was his father's pride. A father's disgrace was his children's burden. Punishments like the Cangue radiated outward, infecting not just the condemned, but everyone tied to him. Neighbors avoided the family. Marriages became harder to arrange. Opportunities for business or education closed. The weight of the collar pressed not just on shoulders, but on generations. This cultural dynamic made the Cangue more than a device. It was a weapon aimed at identity. Where a whip scarred the skin, the Cangue scarred the soul. It robbed a man of his face in the most literal sense, framing it in wood, branding it with shame, and exposing it to the world. The idea that shame was more powerful than pain was not unique to China. But in Qing Dynasty society, It was deeply ingrained in the moral fabric. A man could recover from broken bones, but could he recover from the whispers of his neighbors? Could his children erase the memory of their father kneeling in the market, a sign above his head declaring him a thief? Foreign observers often misunderstood this. Western travelers compared the Cangue to stocks or pillories in Europe, where criminals were mocked by crowds. But they failed to see the deeper cultural sting. In Europe, the punishment was often about ridicule. In China, it was about permanent dishonor. The public spectacle was not just a moment of laughter. It was a sentence of disgrace that could last a lifetime. Even within the Chinese justice system, officials recognized the power of shame. They often favored punishments that preserved life but destroyed dignity, reasoning that the lesson would echo longer. Death silenced a man. Humiliation made him speak without words for as long as he lived. This emphasis on shame also reinforced the state's authority. The Cangue reminded citizens that their honor was not entirely their own. It could be taken, stripped, and displayed at the will of the law. In a society where harmony was valued above individuality, the message was chilling. Your actions did not belong only to you. They belonged to your community, your ancestors, and your descendants. To be humiliated in public was to betray them all. This is why the Cangue struck so deeply. It was not just about suffering in the moment. It was about creating a memory so painful, so unforgettable, that it reshaped not only the life of the condemned, but the lives of everyone around him. The Cangue was heavy wood, yes, but its true weight was symbolic. It carried the crushing burden of lost honor, a punishment that outlasted pain, outlasted wounds, sometimes even outlasted death itself. The Cangue may seem uniquely Chinese, but the idea of using public humiliation as punishment has existed in nearly every society. Across continents and centuries, rulers discovered the same truth. Shame can be more enduring than pain, and humiliation can be a sharper weapon than chains. In medieval Europe, the stocks and pillory served much the same role as the Cangue. Criminals were locked in wooden frames, their heads and hands trapped, their bodies exposed to the crowd. Positioned in town squares, they became objects of ridicule. Passers-by hurled insults, rotten food, and sometimes stones. The punishment was not only discomfort, it was the destruction of dignity. The pillory was infamous for turning justice into spectacle. Thieves, liars, and cheats stood immobilized while neighbors jeered. For hours or days, their shame was on display. Like the Cangue, the pillory announced crimes publicly, often with signs or inscriptions. A man could endure the beating of a cane and heal, but his reputation, shredded by the eyes of the community, often never recovered. In colonial America, these traditions crossed the Atlantic. The Puritans of New England placed adulterers, drunkards, and petty criminals in the stocks. In some cases, offenders were forced to wear signs proclaiming their sins: fornicator, blasphemer, drunkard. Just as in China, shame was wielded not only against the individual but against their families, reinforcing the social order through humiliation. Even in France, until the late 18th century, the carcan, a type of iron collar, was used to restrain criminals in public squares, echoing the symbolism of the Cangue. Bound by iron or wood, displayed for all to see, the condemned learned that the greatest punishment was exposure. But while similarities abound, differences reveal cultural contrasts. In the West, these punishments often emphasized ridicule. Crowds laughed, mocked, and sometimes assaulted the prisoner. It was a carnival of shame where punishment mixed with entertainment. In China, by contrast, the Cangue carried deeper weight. It was not simply mockery, it was dishonor. In a Confucian world, shame struck not only the man but his lineage. His disgrace rippled across generations, poisoning the family name. Another difference lay in symbolism. In Europe, stocks and pillories were transitional punishments, harsh but temporary. They gradually disappeared as prisons became the dominant form of justice in the 18th and 19th centuries. In China, the Cangue endured longer, its symbolism tied to centuries of philosophy. It persisted even as the empire modernized, a stubborn relic of a belief that humiliation was essential for order. Yet both East and West reveal the same universal pattern. Human societies have always weaponized shame. From Rome, where criminals were paraded in chains, to England, where debtors wore placards through the streets, the principle was identical. To punish in private was not enough. Justice had to be seen. The reason is simple. Pain is invisible once it fades. A scar can be hidden under clothing. But shame, when displayed in front of neighbors, becomes memory. Communities remember the thief, the liar, the adulterer, not because of their crime, but because of the spectacle of their humiliation. This is why public punishments were so effective. They were not only about deterrence. They were about reinforcing community identity. By mocking the guilty, society reassured itself of its own virtue. By shaming one, it strengthened the many. The Cangue in China and the pillory in Europe were worlds apart in culture, yet they spoke the same language of humiliation. They remind us that across civilizations, rulers understood the same truth. The greatest prison is not built of stone or wood. It is built of eyes, of whispers, of shame carried like a brand upon the soul. By the late 19th century, China was a nation standing between two worlds. On one side lay centuries of imperial tradition, guided by Confucian values and rigid hierarchies. On the other lay the growing pressures of modernity, Western influence, industrial technologies, and political upheaval. Yet in the midst of railroads, telegraphs, and steamships, the Cangue still stood as a symbol of justice. Foreign visitors to China in the late Qing dynasty were often astonished to see men and women in the wooden collar, displayed in public squares as if time itself had stopped. For Europeans and Americans who thought of stocks and pillories as relics of their own medieval past, the Cangue looked like a glimpse into another era, archaic yet alive. Reports from missionaries, diplomats, and travelers describe streets where vendors sold tea beside prisoners locked in cangues. The clash was jarring, modern goods and ancient punishments side by side. To outsiders, it seemed proof of China's resistance to change. To Chinese officials, it was simply continuity, justice performed as it had been for generations. But cracks were forming. The late Qing period was marked by rebellion, reform, and foreign intrusion. The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Boxer Uprising all shook the empire to its core. With each crisis came calls for modernization, not just in the military and economy, but in law and justice. Reformers argued that punishments like the Cangue made China appear weak and backward in the eyes of foreign powers. Still, the Cangue endured. Part of the reason was practicality. It was cheap to build, required no prisons, and doubled as both restraint and punishment. In an empire as vast as China, with limited infrastructure, the Cangue remained a convenient tool of control. Another reason was symbolism. Even as reformers pushed for modern codes, many officials clung to the belief that shame was essential for order. They argued that prisons isolated criminals but did not teach society. The Cangue, with its public spectacle, continued to serve as a visible deterrent. Photographs from the early 20th century show the persistence of this tradition. Long after Western nations had abandoned their pillories, Chinese cities still displayed men in wooden collars, their crimes written above their heads. In some regions, the practice continued well into the Republican era after the fall of the Qing in 1911. Yet the tide of history was against it. As legal reforms spread, the Cangue gradually became less common. New penal codes introduced prisons, fines, and more modern forms of justice modeled on Western systems. Public punishments began to lose favor, criticized as brutal relics of the past. By the mid-20th century, the Cangue had largely disappeared. but its legacy lingered, remembered in photographs, in records, and in the stories of those who had endured it. For some, it was a reminder of the cruelty of the old order. For others, it was a symbol of discipline lost in the chaos of modernization. The persistence of the Cangue into the age of modern China shows how deeply cultural values can root themselves in systems of justice. It also reveals the tension between tradition and change, between a society's past and its future. Even as China built railways and adopted telegraphs, it clung to the idea that shame could govern behavior as effectively as any prison wall. In this way, the Cangue was more than a punishment. It was a mirror of a nation in transition, caught between the weight of history and the pull of modernity. When foreign travelers arrived in China during the late Qing dynasty, they encountered not only an ancient civilization, but also its instruments of justice. Among the most unforgettable sights was the Cangue, a punishment that left a deep impression on outsiders, who recorded what they saw in journals, letters, and reports. Missionaries often described their shock at seeing men and women confined in heavy wooden collars. Used to the prisons and court systems of Europe or America, they regarded the Cangue as a relic of the medieval past. To them, it seemed both cruel and strangely theatrical, a punishment that turned human suffering into a public show. One American missionary in the 1880s wrote of seeing a man in a Cangue outside a temple, his crime written on a board above his head. The missionary noted the indifference of the crowd. Vendors sold fruit nearby, children played, and passers-by barely paused to look. What shocked the foreigner most was not only the punishment itself, but how ordinary it seemed to the locals. Diplomats, too, left detailed accounts. European envoys stationed in Beijing described Cangues lined up near government offices, where convicted criminals waited out their sentences under the sun. Some reported that officials proudly explained the practice as a form of moral instruction, insisting that the public needed visible examples to understand the consequences of crime. Travel writers, fascinated by the exotic and the strange, included vivid descriptions in their books. They spoke of men staggering under the weight of giant wooden frames, struggling to eat or drink while crowds watched. For Western readers, these accounts painted China as a land of contrasts, advanced in philosophy and culture, yet bound to punishments that seemed barbaric by modern standards. Not all observers condemned the practice outright. Some admitted that, in their own countries, public punishments had once been common. They compared the Cangue to the stocks and pillories of Europe, recognizing a shared human tendency to shame offenders in public. What set China apart, they noted, was how deeply tied the Cangue was to cultural values of honor and face. Illustrations and early photographs taken by foreigners further spread the image of the Cangue abroad. In European magazines and American newspapers, engravings showed Chinese prisoners with enormous wooden collars, surrounded by curious crowds. These images often reinforced stereotypes of China as archaic, reinforcing calls for modernization and civilization in the wake of Western imperial ambitions. Missions and humanitarian groups used such images to raise sympathy, and sometimes donations, by portraying the Chinese justice system as cruel and outdated. To them, the Cangue was not only a punishment, but a symbol of a society in need of reform. For the prisoners themselves, however, foreign witnesses offered little relief. Their presence did not change the weight of the wood or the sting of humiliation. If anything, it spread their shame further, broadcasting their suffering across oceans. And yet, these testimonies are invaluable today. They give us voices from the past, perspectives that allow us to reconstruct how the Cangue appeared not only to those who endured it, but also to those who saw it from the outside. They remind us that punishment is never only local. It is always observed, interpreted, judged. Through the eyes of missionaries, diplomats, and travelers, the Cangue became part of global memory. It crossed borders not as wood and iron, but as stories, sketches, and photographs. And in doing so, it shaped the world's image of China in the 19th century, a place of profound wisdom, yes, but also of punishments that seemed frozen in time. The story of the Cangue is not only about China. It is part of a larger truth. Across civilizations, societies have turned to public shame as one of their most powerful tools of justice. From the stocks of medieval Europe to the scarlet letters of colonial America, from the whippings in African slave plantations to the branded faces of criminals in ancient Rome, humiliation has been used as a weapon everywhere. The logic was always the same. Punish one person visibly, and the entire community will learn the lesson. Why was shame so effective? Because it attacked what people valued most: their identity, their belonging, their place in the group. Pain hurt the body, but shame isolated the soul. A man beaten in secret could recover in silence. A man disgraced in public was marked forever, even after his wounds healed. Communities thrived on collective memory. Villages remembered who had been placed in the stocks. Families carried the weight of dishonor long after a crime was paid for. Shame was sticky. It clung longer than bruises, longer than scars, sometimes longer than life itself. This explains why so many societies chose humiliation as punishment. It was cheap. It required no prisons, no guards, no elaborate infrastructure. A wooden frame, a sign, a public square, that was all it took to enforce order. The crowd became the warden, the whispers became the bars, the shame became the cell. But public punishment was never only about the criminal. It was about the audience. By displaying a thief in the square or a debtor in chains, authorities reminded everyone watching who held power. The spectacle was not simply a warning. It was a performance of authority. Justice was staged, not hidden. The message was loud. The state sees you. The state judges you. The state owns your honor. The danger of such systems was that they blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Crowds sometimes mocked, spat, or assaulted the condemned, turning punishment into entertainment. In some cases, death came not from the sentence itself, but from the violence of the mob. The theater of shame could slip easily into the theater of vengeance. And yet, humiliation endured for centuries because it worked. It reinforced cultural values. It reminded communities of their boundaries. It created fear stronger than any fine or prison term. To live in fear of shame was to live in obedience. The Cangue was one of the clearest examples of this weapon, but its story is echoed in every culture that has used shame to control its people. It teaches us that punishment has never been only about crime. It has been about identity, reputation, and the fragile balance between the individual and the community. As modern societies move toward prisons and private systems of justice, public humiliation became less common, but its spirit did not vanish. Even today, shame remains a powerful force. Social stigma, public exposure, and reputational ruin still shape behavior as much as laws. In the digital age, shame travels faster than ever, amplified by headlines and social media. What once happened in the market square now happens online, in front of millions. The lesson of history is clear. The weapon of shame is universal, timeless, and deeply human. The Cangue, the stocks, the pillory, all were instruments of wood and iron. But their true power lay in the eyes of the crowd, in the whispers of neighbors, in the silence of exclusion. To understand them is to understand something about ourselves. That as much as we fear pain, we fear dishonor even more. And that across civilizations, the greatest punishment has never been death, it has been disgrace. The Cangue may have vanished from the streets of China, but its shadow remains. The wooden collar was more than a punishment. It was a symbol, a reminder of how deeply shame can wound, how humiliation can break a spirit, how reputation can be as fragile as bone. When we look back at the Cangue today, through faded photographs and written accounts, we see more than a device of wood and nails. We see a philosophy of control, a belief that the body could be used as a billboard, that a human being could be transformed into a warning. It tells us that the state understood something timeless, that people fear disgrace more than they fear pain. The Cangue teaches us that punishment was never only about the crime. It was about the performance. A man kneeling under the weight of wood was not simply paying for theft or fraud. He was acting in a play stage for the community. His shame became the script, his suffering the message, his silence the lesson. And everyone who watched became part of the spectacle, complicit in his humiliation. This is what makes the Cangue unforgettable. It reminds us that justice has always been more than rules and laws. It has been theater, ritual, memory. It has been about teaching obedience through the body of another. But the story of the Cangue is not only about cruelty. It is also about resilience. For every man who broke under its weight, there were others who endured, who survived the whispers, who rebuilt their lives after disgrace. Even in humiliation, there were sparks of humanity, family members who brought food, strangers who offered water, prayers whispered in the night. The Cangue destroyed dignity, but it could not erase hope. As we reflect on this history, we must ask, have we truly left the Cangue behind? The wooden collar may be gone, but the principle of public shame endures. Today, humiliation spreads not through markets and courtyards, but through headlines, cameras, and screens. The crowd that once gathered in the square now gathers online, and the whispers of neighbors are amplified into the voices of millions. This is the lasting power of the Cangue. It is a mirror. It forces us to see that the instinct to disgrace, to isolate, to control through shame is not locked in the past. It is a part of human nature, resurfacing in every age under new forms. The man in the Cangue, struggling under the weight of wood, is not only a figure of Qing dynasty China. He is a reflection of us all, the fear we carry of exposure, the dread of dishonor, the knowledge that reputation can be destroyed in a single moment. And so, the Cangue remains a lesson about power, about dignity, about the human need for respect, a lesson that the heaviest chains are not made of iron or wood, but of shame. When the last Cangue was dismantled, it did not vanish from memory. It became part of history's archive, part of the story of how societies discipline and control. And it whispers to us still, beware the weight of disgrace, for it can crush more than the body. It can crush the soul. In the end, the Cangue was never just a collar. It was a symbol of how fear and humiliation can govern lives, a symbol of the fragile line between justice and cruelty, a symbol that reminds us that the greatest prison is not built of stone or bars. It is built in the eyes of others, in the silence of exclusion, in the unbearable weight of shame.